I've expanded your script to make it longer, more detailed, and more emotionally engaging while still keeping it simple and continuous. I walked into my courtroom that Thursday morning and saw a woman in her mid 70s sitting in the plaintiff's chair. Her name was Helen. She looked exhausted, fragile, and emotionally drained, like someone who had been carrying a silent burden for years. Sitting across from her was her daughter Yvonne, 46 years old, well dressed, confident, and completely composed, as if nothing about this case could possibly shake her. Helen was suing her own daughter for financial exploitation. What made this case different was that Yvonne hadn't stolen money in secret or through fraud. She had done everything legally. 3 years earlier, Helen had been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. It was not severe dementia. Helen was still living independently, managing her daily life and making her own decisions. But the diagnosis worried her. She feared becoming a burden. That's when Yvonne stepped in and suggested she become Helen's power of attorney. She told her it was just a precaution, something responsible, something that would help manage things if Helen's condition ever worsened. Helen trusted her daughter completely. She signed the documents without hesitation, believing she was doing the right thing for her future safety. At first, everything looked normal. Yvonne paid bills, managed accounts, and handled basic financial tasks. Helen felt relieved, believing she had made a smart decision. But slowly, things began to change. It started small. Yvonne suggested that Helen didn't need to carry her credit cards anymore because it was safer if she kept them. Helen agreed. Then came the debit card. Yvonne said she would manage withdrawals and give Helen cash whenever she needed it. Again, Helen agreed, trusting her daughter's judgment. Within a few months, Helen had no direct access to her own money. Every single expense had to go through Yvonne. If Helen needed groceries, she had to ask. If she wanted to buy clothes, she had to ask. If she wanted to go out for lunch with friends, she had to ask for cash. And more often than not, Yvonne would say no or limit how much she could spend. Even though Helen had a steady income of nearly $60,000 a year from her pension, Social Security, and investments, she began living like someone with almost nothing. Her apartment became simple, her wardrobe stopped changing, and her social life slowly disappeared. The financial records showed a much deeper issue. Yvonne had been paying herself monthly fees that kept increasing over time. She charged $2,200 as a management fee, hundreds more for transportation services every time she drove her mother anywhere, and additional amounts labeled as household management. In total, she was taking nearly 70% of Helen's income every month. Helen, meanwhile, was left with only scraps of her own money and constant restrictions on how to use it. During her testimony, Helen explained what hurt her the most wasn't just the financial control, it was the emotional control. She described how humiliating it felt to ask her own daughter for permission to buy basic necessities. She said she felt like a child in her own life, stripped of dignity and independence. Her doctor testified that Helen's condition had not significantly worsened over the past 3 years. She was still in the mild stage and fully capable of making her own decisions regarding daily life and finances. The doctor clearly stated that this level of control was unnecessary and could actually harm her mental well-being by increasing dependence. Helen's other daughter, Carol, also testified. Carol lived out of state but had noticed changes in her mother during phone calls. Helen sounded quieter, more anxious, and less confident. When Carol visited, she was shocked to see how much her mother's life had changed. Helen wore old clothes, avoided social activities, and seemed afraid to spend money on even the smallest things. When Carol asked questions, Helen admitted she had to ask Yvonne for everything. That's when Carol began investigating further and eventually helped her mother seek legal help. The most damaging evidence came in the form of text messages between Yvonne and her husband. In those messages, Yvonne openly complained about Helen wanting to spend money on things like clothing or social activities. She wrote that every dollar Helen spent was less for us later, and admitted she was charging as much as she could justify because the remaining money would eventually become her inheritance. Those messages revealed the truth clearly. This was not caregiving. This was financial control motivated by personal gain. When I questioned Yvonne in court, she insisted she was acting in her mother's best interest. She claimed she was protecting her from financial mistakes due to her condition. But when asked simple questions, why Helen couldn't have access to her debit card, why she was paying herself such high fees, and why Helen was living below her means, her answers became vague and inconsistent. It became clear that Helen's independence had been deliberately restricted, not for protection, but for control. After reviewing all the evidence, I ruled in Helen's favor. The power of attorney was immediately revoked. An independent fiduciary was appointed to take over financial management. I ordered Yvonne to repay a portion of the excessive fees she had taken and restore full financial access to her mother. Helen finally regained control of her life and her money. Within weeks, the change in her was visible. She started going out again, meeting friends, buying clothes she liked, and living without asking permission. The anxiety that had defined her for years began to fade. She was no longer living under constant restriction. However, the emotional damage remained. Helen decided to cut off contact with Yvonne and even removed her from her will. The betrayal had gone too deep for reconciliation. This case showed how financial abuse can exist even within legal frameworks. Everything Yvonne did appeared legitimate on paper, but the reality was control, exploitation, and emotional manipulation disguised as care. Yvonne claimed she was protecting her mother, but the evidence proved otherwise. In the end, Helen didn't just win a case in court. She regained her independence, her dignity, and her right to live her own life.